So welcome to our business webinar program presented by Bank of America. Today's session is a new kind of networking, and we will learn smart techniques for connecting authentically, how to talk about ourselves in a way that connects with people, how to nurture those connections, and so much more. I'm Desiree Brown, Senior Manager of Digital Content and Education here at the Tory Burch Foundation. I am so excited to be here with Allison Shapira today. Allison is an opera singer turned entrepreneur, founder and CEO of Global Public Speaking. And so after Allison's presentation, we will have plenty of time for Q&A. So we do ask that you put your questions for Allison in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. Again, please take notes. Today's session will be recorded, and so watch your inbox for the replay link. And with that, over to you, Allison. Let's get started.
Fantastic. Thank you, Desiree. And it's great to see so many wonderful names in the chat, some familiar names and some friends who have joined from around the country. Did you ever enter a room and feel like something was wrong? That was me 12 years ago. I had just been offered a job at a consulting firm in Washington, D.C. I was working for a large organization in Boston. And this job in DC was an amazing opportunity for me. It would have doubled my salary and given me financial independence for the first time in my life. I didn't think twice about it. I gave notice on my job in Boston, flew to DC to sign the contract, just a technicality. From the moment I entered that room, not as a prospective new hire, but as part of the leadership team, I knew it was the wrong place for me. Everything in my body, my head, my heart, my gut said, this is not where you should be. So on the third day, I walked into the boss's office, kept the door open, and I quit. And I went back to Boston, where I now had no job and no place to live. Through process of elimination, I applied for jobs, I didn't get them, or I applied for jobs and then I turned them down. Nothing worked. Process of elimination. I decided to start my own company, to take a side business I'd had on the side for 10 years, teaching public speaking and presentation skills, and launch it full-time as my sole source of income. And I needed to get out of Boston. I needed a fresh start. So I moved to DC. I moved to DC without a single client, but with a strong network of friends, classmates, former colleagues. The clock was ticking. I needed to make rent. I set myself a goal of 2 networking coffees per day, every single day of the week. And now I didn't have a big client name behind me. I wasn't representing this large organization. I was just representing myself. 2 cups of coffee every single day. I reached out to anyone I had ever met who lived in DC. I didn't ask for business. I asked for advice on how my skills would be valuable in their industry. Advice turned to business. And in the first year, I had 35 clients and I was profitable. Not by much, but I was definitely profitable. 12 years later, we're a global training firm working with the largest organizations in the world. And I share this because networking is single-handedly how I built my company. And you can do it too. So today I'll talk to you about a holistic approach to networking that you can use to build skills and strategies that yield tangible business results. And my goal is that each one of you, no matter what industry you're in, no matter your personality style, each one of you can take something away from today's session. These tools are free. You can implement them yourself, and you can implement them every single day. As a business owner, how amazing does it feel when there are strategies that you can use that don't cost money, that you don't have to manage in other people? So these are tools intended for you to use daily. And networking can take many different forms. It can be online, it can be in person, it can be live, as in live online or in person, or it can be through email. Because my expertise is how leaders communicate, I'm going to focus on the networking that happens in events and one-on-one meetings. And there's so much that we could talk about. We have an hour, less than an hour today. We have so little time and so much to cover. That's why I want to focus it on how we network in the way we communicate using our voice. And I'd love to see in the chat, how do you feel about networking? Go ahead and put that in the chat. How do you feel about networking? Because most people, yeah, I see ick, I see anxious, intimidating. A lot of people hate it. Maybe you feel shy. Exactly. It's daunting, and it's daunting because of bad networking. So I'm going to show you good networking. I know there are a couple of people who love to meet new people, love to do it. That's great. I'm going to help make you more effective at it as well. So today we'll cover 3 areas in the way in which we approach networking. We'll talk about the purpose, here we go, purpose of networking, the people we network with, and then the practice of networking, so that you can start by using your sense of purpose to drive you in your networking, so that anyone who responded ick or anxious or scared, your purpose grounds you and makes it easier and, dare I say, sometimes fun. And then we think about the people in our network to expand that idea of who we can network with. Finally, we'll spend time talking about the practice of networking. How do you speak with clarity and confidence in a way that cuts through the noise? So let's start with the purpose, the way in which we approach networking. And we need a mindset shift in order to do this, because networking is a fundamental belief in yourself and in others. It's recognizing you have something that is of value to others. Your perspective, your experience, even if your experience is what not to do, your connections, and then any products or services that you offer. So it's recognition that you have something of value to offer. It's also recognition others have something to offer you. Perspective, experience, connections. So it's looking at networking from this abundance mindset, this idea of interconnectedness, that all of us have something to help one another with. You can't do it all yourself. And I know people who start businesses and they say, I just want to do everything myself. We never do anything ourselves. We always need clients, staff, suppliers, distributors, tech support. And the most important resources in your life, people, capital, opportunities, will not be posted online. They will come through your network. It's like we're building a business. When we're building a business, we're putting together this enormous puzzle that doesn't have a cover. You may think the cover is going to look one way, but then someone gives you a new puzzle piece and you think, oh, well, wait, maybe it's going to look differently. Or a client asks for something you've never done before, and in the moment you say, yes, of course we do that. Or your star employee listens to a new podcast episode and comes up with a brilliant new idea for your organization. Networking is a significant part of how to find one another, to put those puzzle pieces together like a global treasure hunt. So that's the purpose of networking. Let's talk about your purpose when you network, because a lot of you wrote ick, awkward, anxious, scared, uncomfortable. I want to help you network in a way that's authentic and confident so that you can avoid that inauthentic transactional feel in those networking conversations. And I live in Washington, D.C. I know a lot about the transactional, icky feeling of networking. So how do you go deep and have real conversations when you're networking? I'm going to give you a tactical tool right now to tap into your sense of purpose before a networking situation. Whether you're at an event, about to have a one-on-one meeting with someone, how do you tap into your sense of purpose? You do it by asking yourself one profound question. And this is a question I recommend people ask before they craft a presentation or a speech. Ask yourself the question before the networking event, why you? Why you does not mean, why are you qualified? Where did you go to school? How many years of experience do you have? Those are external validators. By why you, I mean, why do you care about the work you do, about the people that you impact? And when was a moment in your life that made you care? Because when you think about that sense of purpose as an entrepreneur, it could be your origin story. What is it that propelled you to launch the business? For me, you heard my origin story when I started our session today. Why you? Why do you care? When you repeat that answer to yourself, all of a sudden the networking becomes easier because you're grounded in your sense of purpose. And I'd love to see in the chat, what's your why you as it relates to the company that you've founded, whether it's a product or a service? Why do you care? And when was a moment in your life that made you care? I'd love to see some of those in the chat. It's not what you do, it's why you do it. Does it come from an experience you had growing up? It could be something that happened last week when your team pulled together to help a client in need, and you could not have been prouder and thought, this is why we do what we do. This is why we're here every day. So ask yourself what your why you is as it relates to the work that you do. I'm seeing some wonderful ones in the chat. It gives you purpose because you can help other people. You like building partnerships. Great. Why? Let's go deeper. It's more than just because I believe in service or because I like to help people. It's deeper than that. And sometimes you have to ask yourself why 5 times to arrive at the core depth of what you do. And when we have time in the Q&A later on, I would love to hear some of your why yous as examples as well. Here's why the why you is important. It grounds you in your sense of purpose. It calms you, and it helps you calm your nerves because you realize in the act of networking, a lot of us are afraid of asking for favors or talking about ourselves. You are not the center of attention. Your product is the center of attention. Your mission is the center of attention. The people you serve or the people you represent are the center of attention. And it makes you realize you're not in the spotlight. You become a searchlight that you shine on the issues that you care about. And all of a sudden, you can't wait to get out there and network because you've got work to do. And there are people there who can help make you more impactful. And I am so glad that my friend Dave Bricker is here on this webinar, because I'm going to quote Dave Bricker, one of my favorite people, fellow speaker and speaker coach, who says, when you do this, you go from nervous to service. And that's what I want you to think about doing before you network. Why do you care? When was a moment in your life that made you care? And it grounds you in who you are and what you want to achieve. And when you do that, you become incredibly powerful in your networking. So that's how I approach the purpose of networking. Why do we do it? We do it because every single person out there has a piece of the puzzle that can help us. And by tapping into our sense of purpose, we realize why it's critical, and it helps us stand tall. It gives us the confidence we need to go out there, approach someone, and start a conversation, which we'll talk about how to do a little bit later. Let's now move on to the people with whom we network. Our networks are broader than we realize. I'd like you to think about right now, what are all of those networks that you're a part of? Maybe it's your association. Many of us here are part of the National Speakers Association, an incredible network. Maybe it's your graduate school. Maybe it's your undergraduate, or even some people go to kindergartens where there are networks as they get older. I don't know. I didn't go to a kindergarten like that. But we have schools that are part of our network. We have hobbies that are part of our network. Our religious institution is part of our network. My question to you is your network wide enough? Because the self-similarity principle tells us we network with people who are like us. But the people who can help us, the people who have pieces of the puzzle, may not be just like us. And this can be insulating. If we're always talking to people who are comfortable, who are similar to us, then we're missing critical pieces of the puzzle that can help us in our business. Now, it's important to have a close circle of peer mentors, but that's not enough. Opportunities come more from our weak ties than from our strong ties. And a number of studies from 1973 up and until today continue to show weak ties produce better results than stronger ties. So that's how we learn new information. That's how we get different points of view. That's how we find new opportunities. So while you might focus on the networks that you're comfortable with, that you've always gone to, think about how that might limit you in your opportunities to move forward. And what are those new networks that you can be a part of? Because I would say your network is all around you. I have found 3 clients dancing tango in Washington, D.C. It just so happens a lot of people who work at the World Bank like to dance tango. I love to dance tango. And so we make small talk in between the dances. And it turns out they need leadership development. So I don't go to tango to get clients, but I happen to have found 3 clients dancing tango. I have found clients on the water taxi in Annapolis, Maryland. We never know who can help us, who has a piece of the puzzle. And how do we meet these people? By being curious and by being a connector. Every time I meet people, I'm thinking, who do I know who I can connect you with? Because I have the piece of the puzzle for someone else. So anytime I'm meeting someone, I want to know, who can I connect you with? Who do I know? How am I connecting the dots? The new rules of networking are not about cold outreach on LinkedIn. We tried it during the pandemic. It didn't work for many of us. And to this day, I'm continuously overloaded by people reaching out on LinkedIn for connections who want to sell services to me. And unless we have a shared connection who recommended we speak, I don't respond. I can't. I don't have time. My team needs me. My client needs me. The cold networking outreach online that we tried has not worked for me. If it works for you, phenomenal. Let me know how you did it. For me, it doesn't work, which means the new rules of networking are the old school rules of connection, together with the power of authenticity. So now that we've talked about the purpose of networking, we've talked about the people who are in our network. Note to self, don't talk while putting the straw in my mouth. Take a sip of water and then continue to talk. So we've talked about the first 2 components. I want to really spend time now on the 3rd component of networking, which is the practice of networking, which is critical. And this is where I want to spend the most time, because I have a feeling this is what led to those feelings of ick and awkwardness and discomfort. So let's talk about this now. And let's teach you a framework that you can use to network confidently and clearly. There are different types of networking when we practice networking. There are groups, there are one-on-one events or one-on-one meetings. I like to think about them in terms of what beverages are served when we're there. Wine versus coffee. And we know that the group networking situations, those events tend to lead to one-on-one networking situations. So let's focus on the groups. The groups are where we tend to find the most anxiety. I estimate, this is my number after 20 years, over 20 years in this business, 30% of networking is awkward and uncomfortable. We don't know how people are going to react. We don't know what our chemistry is going to be when talking to them. There are people out there who don't care about us. In Washington, D.C., I'm shaking your hand and you're looking over my shoulder at someone more important to talk to. That's the way it is in Washington, D.C. We live with it, but the goal is to extricate ourselves from those situations and find the people whose eyes light up when you say what you do. If they're not interested, it is not your job to try to make them interested. It's to learn more about them. If there isn't a point of connection or a reason to continue, we simply say, do you have a business card? I really enjoyed speaking with you. Hope you enjoy the rest of the event. And the business card becomes the cue that the relationship is coming to a close. We'll talk about that in a minute. I find the best networking events do not have the word networking in the title. Networking events, usually, if they have networking in the title, they attract people who have something to sell, which means you have a lot of buyers in the room, a lot of sellers in the room walking around looking for buyers. The buyers are not there. The best networking events are substantive, content-focused events, industry events where you can have substantive conversations that lead to a networking opportunity. And the best networkers are those who listen before they talk. So those of you who are introverts, nod your head. I can't see you if you nod your head, but still, I'll know you're doing it. Nod your head if you're an introvert. You have a natural advantage because introverts will listen more than they talk. Broadly speaking, everyone is different. I identify as an ambivert, which means I'm both introverted and extroverted, depending on the day, depending on the situation, sometimes depending on how much I've eaten that day. So I have both introvert and extroverted tendencies. So I'm an ambivert. And introverts actually have a better advantage when networking because you can ask questions such as, what brings you here? That's so interesting. How did you get into that field? The question I'm asking everyone at every event I go to is, how are you using AI? And how do you think it will affect your industry? And that leads to such a rich conversation. Then, and only then, will I talk about myself and what I do. And some of you love to network, you love to talk. I can relate to that. What I find is sometimes we love to talk so much that we're not actually listening to what the other people are saying. We're simply thinking about what we're going to jump in and how we relate to that person, but we're not keeping the attention on them, which is a skill that we have to develop. Once you've asked questions, once you've understood the other person, now it's time to talk about yourself. And this is where I want to share with you a special framework that I have created. Because these days, I find people either say too much or too little about themselves when they network. They either say too much, as in they jump into their elevator pitch and give you this 2-minute pitch about themselves, which you didn't ask for. Or they say too little and they just say, I'm a lawyer, I'm a banker. And you have nowhere to go with that. So after 20 years of hearing and delivering terrible elevator pitches, I have created something that I call the anti-pitch. And in my keynote speeches, this is how I teach people to introduce themselves and network more effectively at the conference. So I'm going to teach this to you, and I want to see some anti-pitches in the chat as well. In your anti-pitch, I'd like you to think about going from B to C. And I'm not talking about as a business strategy. I mean, I have a background in, and I'm currently. What about your background is relevant to the person you're speaking to? And what are you currently working on that you want them to know about that's important to you? How do you know what's important to them? Because you don't lead with this when you meet someone. You ask them those questions I mentioned earlier before you know how you can frame your anti-pitch. So I'll give you an example that led me to develop the anti-pitch. A number of years ago in DC, I was at a speed networking event, which is kind of like speed dating, but it actually works. And so there's 60 people in the room. We're getting ready for the speed networking. It's the networking before the networking. And I see someone off by the side by himself, wearing a suit, not looking very comfortable. And my way of operation is I like to find people who are by themselves because it's easier to approach them in that case. So I walk up to him and I say, hi. And I ask the DC question, which is, what do you do? And he says, oh, I'm not working right now. I said, are you looking for a job? He goes, yeah. I asked, well, what industry are you looking in? And he goes, consulting. Okay. I said, that's a pretty broad industry. What aspect of consulting? And he says, supply chain logistics. Okay, that's actually a very specific niche within consulting. Do you have any experience in that area? And he says, yeah, I actually just moved back to the States after 5 years in London working on transatlantic supply chain issues. Oh, okay, you actually know what you're talking about in this area. I asked him, can I give you some advice? You're about to meet 60 people in Washington, D.C. I can guarantee at least 3 of them will work at consulting firms and can figure out who the person is on the team who deals with transatlantic or supply chain issues. So the next time someone asks you, what do? You say, well, I have a background in transatlantic supply chain issues, and I'm currently relocating to the US to apply that knowledge to a consulting firm. Do you see the difference? The first example, I had to talk to him for 5 full minutes to understand what he did. He needed a job. He had something that was important to him, but he made me ask 5 minutes worth of interrogating questions to get to the answer. That is not something that anyone else is going to do. We don't have time for that. You're on a mission. There's work that you want to do. There's change that you want to see in this world. You can't hope that people ask you the right questions to arrive at what you really want to say. So your anti-pitch is looking into your background to say, what's important about my background that's relevant to this person that I want to highlight for them right up front? And then what am I currently working on, looking to do, trying to achieve that I want this person to know about? I'm not pitching. I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for introductions. I'm simply mentioning what I'm currently focused on. And then, yes, awkward situations will still happen. It'll still be 30% awkward, but the right people right away will know what I'm about. And if they can help me, they will help me. That's the power of the anti-pitch. And I want to share a few other examples of how I use this before we mention one other framework that I'll share with you for your conversations. So I'm going to share with you my secret marketing weapon and the way in which I use the anti-pitch. I go to a lot of conferences, not just when I'm the keynote speaker, that's different, but I attend a lot of conferences to learn and network with other people and grow. And I always try to ask the first question. Why? Because everyone listens to the first question. They start to tune out after that. So I have my question. I'm preparing a question while people are speaking on stage. I'm listening. I have a notebook or my phone and I think, okay, what kind of question could I ask? Then I wait for them to prepare for questions. And then they'll say, and now let's turn it over. And I raise my hand. I don't look around to see if someone's going to ask a question first. No, I raise my hand first. Or if there's a microphone for questions, I go and approach the mic when I know they're going to start to ask for questions. And I use my anti-pitch. I might say something like, I run a training firm that teaches public speaking and presentation skills, and I'm currently focused on, and whatever the theme of the conference is my current focus. So if I'm at a banking conference, I'll say, and I'm currently focused on helping bankers develop deeper relationships of trust with their clients. If I'm at a women's conference and I'm currently focused on helping women tap into their authentic voice to speak with confidence. If I'm at an international development conference, it's about how I help people working in international development. Am I lying? No, I do all of those things, but I'm taking the information that's most relevant to the people in the room and front loading it. And then the people who are interested in meeting me, they will approach me. I don't have to meet 300 people in the room. The 3 people who I need to meet will approach me. And they'll usually come up and say, oh, are you the one who teaches public speaking? I needed you last week because our executive has to speak in front of the board and she is not ready for it. So the right people come to talk to me. Couple of key points. It can't be a mean question, as in I'm being disrespectful to the speaker. And it can't be one of those long, drawn out statements that don't actually end in a question mark. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be a brilliant question. It could simply be asking the speaker to expand on something they had said earlier or what they think it means for the future. So the baseline of what the question has to be is very low. It just has to meet the basic rules of decency. And then your anti-pitch is how you introduce yourself. It's short and sweet, and then you immediately transition into the question. You can use it not just to find clients, you can use it to find staff too. I used the anti-pitch at a sales event last year where I was looking for a salesperson, and I have a background. I run a training company, and I'm currently looking for salespeople to come help us find more clients. And my question is, that was my anti-pitch. Someone came up to me afterwards and she said, I know someone. It's not public yet, but she's looking for a new sales role, and I think she'd be a great fit. I actually knew that other person. I didn't know she was looking. And a month later, she came to work for me, all because of the anti-pitch. How do you front load the information that's most important to you in a way that's relevant to the other person in order to achieve your goals? Because every single person has a piece of the puzzle that can help you. Okay, very quickly, we'll go through a framework that you can use when you integrate the anti-pitch into your conversations. I'll share a few final thoughts, and then I'll talk about where we go from here. I want to share with you a framework for how you put this into practice, because there's a particular rhythm to the way that we network as well in those situations that I'd like you to be aware of. And it looks like this. We always lead with curiosity. What brings you here? What did you think of the event, etc.? Then we ask follow-up questions. We don't just say, oh, that's great, and then we launch into our anti-pitch. Ask follow-up questions. Sit in their reality for a little bit. Then use your anti-pitch once you've learned about who they are. Ask them more questions. Again, keep it focused on them, and then bring the conversation to a close. It's a quick and easy way for you to engage in conversation and then move on, because your goal is not to have a one-on-one at that event with one particular person, even if they feel comfortable. It's to establish there's something to discuss. You take their business card or you exchange contact information on LinkedIn. I don't always carry business cards anymore. And then you move on to someone else. And the in-person networking event can lead to a virtual coffee or an in-person coffee. Let me share a few final thoughts, and then I will turn it over. Actually, a few final thoughts, and then I have something to ask you. A few final thoughts. If you meet someone at a networking event and never follow up, it's as if you never met them, which means when you block off time for an event on your calendar, block off 30 minutes the next morning for follow-up. Otherwise, it didn't count. And in your follow-up, think about, how can I be of service? Can I send you an article that would be relevant and interesting to you? Can I introduce you to someone in my network? It doesn't matter how many business cards you give out. If you're taking cards or connecting on LinkedIn, what's important is establishing who are the people worth following up with, because you could also spend all of your day following up with not the right people and having coffee with not the right people. And it's not a good use of your time, and you're not being true to your team when you do that. So figure out who's worth following up with. And then within 24 hours, something that's of value to them. Keep in touch. And remember, those weak ties are even more important than the strong ties. LinkedIn is such a great place for that, because people can see your updates without you pushing notifications on them every week. Networking is like interest. It compounds over time. And the more you pay into it early on, the more it compounds and compounds. And you never know when it's going to come back and somebody is going to remember you and make an introduction for you. You can't control when someone decides to make a decision to work with you or work for you, but you can control how many people you meet and how often they hear from you. That's the strategy of networking. And the final thought that I will share with you here is that anytime I was about to make any major decision in my business or transition point, I always asked people in my network. I found 5 people who had already achieved what I wanted to achieve. I didn't try to do it myself. I reached out to them, even if they were competitors, especially if they were competitors. And I said, how'd you do it? What mistakes did you make? What would you definitely not do? And what would you recommend to me? And through the power of my network, every single decision I've made has come from the wisdom of the people I know, not just reaching out when I need something for them, but always trying to be of service to them so that when I do reach out, they're always willing to take my call or my email. So I'll leave you with a couple of next steps before we open up to the questions, because I'd love to hear your questions. A couple of points here. Find 3 events this month that you're going to attend. If you can find in-person events, I find the networking much more fruitful, even though I love seeing all the conversations here in the chat that I'm trying not to read while I'm talking. Think about what 2 people you can have coffee with every week, not the same people. Every week, 2 different people. When I was doing it 12 years ago, all those coffees were in person. Now it's easier than ever to set up virtual 30-minute sessions with people to get advice and guidance from them. When you're at those events, use your anti-pitch and let it flow into conversation. Remember to lead with curiosity. That's the power of networking. The new rules of networking are back to the basics in terms of authenticity and connection, recognizing that the technology can help us connect, but it does not replace our connection, our human connection. And then I would like to ask you a question before we open it up to your questions. The question for you is, did you learn something useful in today's session? If you did, put a yes in the chat. If you learned something useful, awesome. I love seeing all these yeses. The request is for you to share with me what you've learned. What was most helpful to you? Give me some feedback on what was helpful for you in today's session. It'll also give you a way to stay in touch with me if you'd like to stay in touch and to be able to ask me any follow-up questions that you'd like. There's also a downloadable PDF of my book, Speak with Impact Virtually, to help you in your virtual and hybrid meetings, pitches, and presentations. So thank you in advance for taking the time to scan that QR code and share with me what you learned, what your feedback was, and to get that PDF of my book, Speak with Impact, in virtual format. The new rules of networking are to be yourself, not to try to turn into someone else or some AI avatar of yourself. AI tools can help you, but they can't replace you. They will not replace authentic human connection. As passionate as I am about the potential for AI to help us be more authentic, it still comes down to you harnessing your authentic voice so that you can use that authentic voice to connect with others and drive your business forward. It took me 30 years to find my authentic voice. And it all comes back to why I stopped singing opera. So Desiree introduced me and said that I was a former opera singer. I actually think of myself as a failed opera singer. Failed because I was never good enough to make it in the industry. And for 30 years, I internalized this view of being a failed soprano. And then in the middle of the pandemic, something happened that changed the way I view myself. I started to take virtual voice lessons with an opera singer in Chicago. And I'm right here. It's the middle of 2020. I'm right here at this desk, logging into a virtual voice lesson with this woman I've never met before. I start singing and she cuts me off right away. She says, "What voice part did you say you were?" And I look at her with the arrogance that only a first soprano possesses. And I say, "I'm a first soprano. Isn't that obvious?" And she gets a twinkle in her eye, which we can see over Zoom. And she says, I think I know why you never made it as an opera singer. You're not a soprano. You're a mezzo soprano. And for those of you who don't know, a mezzo can sing as high as a traditional soprano, but we have this big booming middle voice. And if you don't tap into it effectively, you simply sound like a crummy soprano. And for 30 years, I had identified as a crummy, or I had been a crummy soprano, identifying as one. And it had shown up in how I interacted with people and how I sang. And this one woman who never met me before, talk about the power of weak ties in the middle of a global pandemic, taught me a technique that unlocked a voice I had never heard before and had been inside of me all along. So as we bring this session to a close, before we open it up for Q&A, I'll share with you one line of opera in my new and improved mezzo soprano voice, in the hopes that it gets you to look inward to ask why you. Why do you care? When was a moment in your life that made you care? And find this authentic voice that harnesses the power of your confidence to network, to achieve the incredible goals that you've set for yourself in your business. This is a song about freedom. Lascia ch'io pianga mia cruda sorte, e che sospiri la libertà. When you find that voice, it is not the end of the journey. It is just the beginning. And now I would love to hear your questions.
Allison, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions to get through. People were very energized. And so just to get us started, I would love if you could ground us in a couple terms, 30 seconds each, the anti-pitch and weak ties.
Yes, the anti-pitch, and I'll put this back up on this. Let me put this back up on my slides for you. It is a brief, concise summary of who you are and what's most important to you at this moment in time when you introduce yourself to someone else. And I've seen people use this on panels as a way of getting the panelists to introduce themselves in a concise way. So that's the anti-pitch. What was the second question or request?
Weak ties, please.
Weak ties are people we've met once or we've only met virtually. They're not the strong ties of people we've worked with and have known for years. They're not our mentors or our sponsors or our colleagues or the friends that we see. In an association, they could be someone you met once at a conference and never talked to again, as opposed to the people that you go to the conference and sit next to for the entire conference.
Great distinction. Thank you. So your story about getting clients out of dancing tango really resonated with a lot of people. And so to that end, how or when does a casual connection turn into a business opportunity? Did you wait for that potential client to initiate, or did you ask kind of a probing question?
What I would do, because with tango, you dance 4 songs with someone with a brief break in between, and there's this awkward silence in between each break. You say, oh, what do you do in Washington? What brings you here? They say that, and they'd say, I work at the World Bank. I'd say, oh, that's so interesting. I have a lot of clients at the World Bank. What more do you do? And they'd say something. And then they'd say, well, what kind of work do you do at the bank? And I'd say, oh, well, I give keynotes about leadership communication, and I often do high-level executive coaching. That's it. And then they'll say, you know what? My team's doing a lot of presentations. We could really use some help. Let's connect after this. And then the music starts and we keep going. So I talk about what I do. I don't pitch it to them. I just talk about it. And if they have an interest, then that will reveal itself. I don't suggest business cards after a dance. I simply am effusive in talking about what I do because I love what I do.
Excellent advice to both keeping the interaction flowing and getting the job. Okay, so I want to move on to another question, actually about those physical business cards. So you spoke about using physical business cards to close a conversation. And so what I would love to know is what kind of digital information do you exchange, or what tools do you find are most helpful for ways to connect beyond LinkedIn, let's say at an event?
I still find LinkedIn to be the best way to connect, because even if people have a digital business card, we'll bump phones, I get their information, it goes into the abyss of my list of contacts, never to surface ever again. What I liked about the business cards is then I can keep a collection of them, hold on to them until I go through them, and then recycle them when I'm done. So that's what I liked about the business cards. It acted as a to-do list. If it's LinkedIn, what I prefer is let's connect, we'll scan each other's QR codes. Then I take a screenshot, and in my follow-up the next day, I look at the screenshot and I remember to reach out. And the beauty of LinkedIn is now I know they're going to get my updates because I post on a regular basis. So that's why, despite all of the different tools that we have, I still find LinkedIn and physical business cards to be the most effective.
Thank you. Okay, so going back to the subject of being at an event, which we hear you, that is absolutely a great way to meet people and really get that face time, make those connections. We had a great question about how specific you might need to be when you're at an industry specific event or an alumni event where people really have similar backgrounds. Let's say, for example, you go to an event where everyone is a CPA. How do you then either connect or stand out?
I love that question, because what you want to find with the anti-pitch is something that's unique to you. Maybe what's unique is your background. Maybe there's a specific focus of what you're currently working on. So if you're a CPA going to a CPA event, what are you trying to achieve there? Is it just learning and connection? Nothing wrong with that. But if you're looking for the latest trends, then you could say, I've been a CPA for years and I'm currently focused on finding who are the people who really get our industry. And then that leads to a more substantive conversation. So it all depends on what you're hoping to achieve, which is probably going to be unique to you in the way you phrase it.
Sure. That's a great recommendation. And I think that if we're staying with the hypothetical event that you're going to with the hope of expanding your network, we had a great conversation. I'm sorry, a question rather, from Suzanne, who sounds actually a lot like me. I find that I do a great job of listening and probing, but never really get the chance to talk about my work at these events. And so what advice would you have for Suzanne and also me about how to transition to sharing a little bit more about yourself?
That's so
Especially if the person is
interesting.
not asking.
Can you say that again? When the person isn't asking.
Yes,
Right.
I think that's key.
Whatever they're saying, I anchor it. I respond with, oh, that's so interesting. I've thought about myself because and that becomes your transition point. Whatever it is you're talking about underwater basket weaving. Oh, that's so interesting. I've actually thought about that in my own work, even though you wouldn't think so. I have a background in public speaking, and I'm currently helping underwater basket weavers speak clearly and concisely once they come up for air. So that's how I would weave that in.
That's perfect. A great way to use the anti-pitch to find your space in a conversation. Thank you. Okay, and so we have a question that kind of comes from the other end of the spectrum. How do you ask someone about themselves without sounding overly curious? Certainly, there are people who are, perhaps more private, and that it really takes a lot to get a lot of sharing to get them to open up. So
That's right.
how can someone work to find that balance?
I pay very close attention to the way in which they answer my questions. So if I ask them questions and they answer in one word, like let's say, I'm a lawyer. Oh, what kind of law? Divorce law. That's interesting. How'd you get into it? Been doing it my whole life. I'll say, well, that's really interesting. Hey, do you have a card? Okay, great. Let's stay connected. Great to meet you. And then you leave. So I sense that that person doesn't want to talk. I bring it to a close using the card as an excuse, and then I move on. So I'm sensitive. I'm not going to play 20 questions and interrogate someone when I can sense they don't want to. I really have to read the other person, which means I can't be thinking about what I'm going to say all the time.
I mean, it really sounds like something that is simple, but maybe not necessarily easy to do, which is being present.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is hard in some of these high pressure situations. Okay, we have this great question. Again, at this hypothetical event, you're meeting a new person, and you're having a great conversation, and they ask you about a specific fee question. How do you recommend someone redirect that question?
Assuming you don't want to answer what your fee is?
Yes, in that moment, if it feels kind of inappropriate or you maybe don't have enough information, how do you recommend someone redirect those very kind of specific in the weeds questions?
I would say something like, I would be happy to talk about fees with you. I'd want to ask some more information first, and this isn't really the best venue for that. So what's the best way to follow up with you? Let's get a time on the calendar. I want to understand more about where this is coming from and what you're looking for, and then I'd be happy to share fees.
Wonderful. I like that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so the hypothetical event, it ends, and then you're preparing for follow-up. What recommendations do you have for people who have maybe made a lot of wonderful connections, but they're not sure how to keep track of those networking efforts? So let's say you meet someone at that event, you follow up with them, there's radio silence. Then what do you do, and how do you remember to do that?
It's such an important question because, again, you could spend all your time following up with people. We have to decide after the event who's worth following up with and who isn't. Set aside the cards, maybe it's metaphorical cards of the people you're not going to follow up with. Of the people who you do want to follow up with, for whom is there a time-sensitive reason to follow up versus general? If it's time sensitive because they mentioned some specific opportunity to work together, then I'm putting them into my CRM and I'm going to immediately follow up and suggest a meeting, suggest a next step. Versus someone who's interesting to meet, I'll reach out to them, send a follow-up email. I may or may not ask for a follow-up meeting, depending on my bandwidth and the urgency. But I do want to keep a list of people who are worth following up with in general. And this, again, your CRM can be very helpful. What's your client outreach strategy look like where you have touch points? Maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's semi-annual. It depends on you and your timeline. But I would be intentional about what that is so that you know who's worth high touch following up versus who just gets a general touch point. Quick point though, I really need to make this point. We cannot meet someone at an event and then add them to a mailing list. This happens all the time. I connect with someone on LinkedIn, they add me to their newsletter. If you do that, I immediately disconnect from you. So when I talked about client outreach, that's only if there was a specific issue that you discussed and you're going to reach out to them a couple of times. Under no circumstances do you add them to a mailing list unless they have opted into that list. Quick public service announcement.
And on that note, can you expand on why that's maybe not the best practice?
First, there's a legal reason. You are not legally allowed to add them to that list. And second, it is a sign of respect for their bandwidth, as in, I don't have time to have all these newsletters added. And it's hard to explain why. It's just wrong. No, I don't like using it's just wrong because that's subjective. I find it's disrespectful of that person, and it assumes a level of interest that they have in you that they did not express. So it is often inaccurate.
So we had actually a great question from a woman who is having a hard time connecting in an industry based in a country where men are seen as the primary decision makers. And how do you handle that?
I hear that a lot when I travel in my work, especially with women around the world. And there's a very interesting book that I read called Networking and Sex. It's Not What You Think. And the book is really about what it means is it's about networking and gender. They just
Sure.
use the term sex to sell more books.
Of course.
And there were some concepts there that I found very helpful, recognizing in some places the venues in which networking happens are not appropriate for women to attend or to go to from a cultural perspective. So that's one barrier to networking. One of the recommendations from the book that I shared during a program as a fun FYI seemed to strike a chord with some of the women I spoke to, that said, if you're in an event where most of the decision makers are male and you're the CEO, invite a male colleague to come with you. And every time you talk, have him stand next to you and nod thoughtfully. And I said that as a fun joke. And some women in the room said, that's brilliant. And it resonated with them for that context. And so we're always aware of other people's assumptions of us. So what language can we use? In my 20 years working in this industry, what I have found as a CEO is that, and we use certain confidence building credibility boosters to flag our language to get people to take us seriously. And that's what I recommend. The male colleague standing next to you is optional.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great. Thank you for that public service announcement. I also just want to quickly go back to what you said about using your CRM to manage these connections. And for people on, just reminder, CRM is your customer relationship management tool. Do you have a favorite?
I don't have a favorite. I have the one that I use, and that is Zoho. And within the speaking profession, we have an add-on called Speaker Flow that's built on top of Zoho. And we use that both on the sales side and on the operations side. And it's effective. It works for us, and it's the price point that works for our team. And so that's what we use.
Wonderful. Okay, and then we have a great question. Let's say you meet the person or you've scheduled that coffee chat, that one-on-one. How do you recommend preparing for that chat?
I recommend a process that I use when I recommend people prepare strategically for their speeches and presentations. I always want you to ask 3 questions before that meeting. Who's your audience? As in, who are you meeting with and what's important to them? What's your goal in that meeting? Is it just to get to the next meeting? Is it to get an introduction? Is it to get funding? And then why you? Why do you care? Because then again, that grounds you in your sense of purpose and makes the conversation more authentic, more genuine, more purpose driven. And I will do that in advance before the meeting, asking the 3 questions. And then I'll think of some additional questions I'd like to ask that person, so that in the meeting, I'm not just talking about myself the whole time, which I believe is a waste of a meeting.
Absolutely. Allison, thank you so, so much. I really appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining us. I think, I'm sorry, just give me